Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to Disaster Hack. I'm really pleased you could join me today. Let's go. So we're going to talk about the actors that get involved in disasters, the individuals and groups that prepare and respond to those damaging and destructive and disruptive events. So this could include officials in the Emergency Operations Center, first responders in the field, and even citizens and emergent groups. So our learning objective is to discuss who's involved and what their responsibilities are. Well, let's begin with a very important quote from Kate Hell. She was an emergency manager in Florida when Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992. And as she looked at all the devastation around her and wondered how she was going to deal with it in terms of adjusting and adapting and responding to the devastation, she asked, where in the hell is the cavalry on this one? And we're going to ask the same question. Who can help us in a disaster situation? Where there's really four categories of participants. There's public sector. This would be government, including tribal governments. The private sector, which would be businesses. The nonprofit sector, such as organizations like the American Red Cross. And then citizens and emergent groups. We're going to talk about each one of these categories. So let's begin with the public sector. So the public sector includes government. This would be government officials and agencies and departments at all levels, so local, regional, state, federal, and tribal. And let's begin with the local government. So there are elected officials that get involved in disasters, so the mayor or the county judge or county commissioners, for instance. There's dedicated emergency managers, as well as police, fire, EMS, and other responders. And then, of course, we have floodplain managers who help us to gauge flood levels, public information officers that share details about what is going on with citizens. And then we also have a whole host of other departments and agencies and organizations. And keep in mind that every jurisdiction is different. But we might have the Department of Transportation or Public Works that help us to repair roads and bridges after an event. In a pandemic, public health would become involved. Parks and Rec has a lot of personnel and heavy equipment so they could remove debris. In a mass fatality incident, we would have the coroner's office involved in identifying the deceased. And then the engineering department may get involved in damage assessment. So these are just some of the many government agencies at the local level that could be involved and participate. Now, in a disaster that really stresses the abilities of a local government, that local government may need to seek mutual aid from external jurisdictions. And so they can call on the services of other fire departments from nearby communities to help and assist. And this is very important. In a major event, we might need to have more coordination and collaboration across counties, for example. And so regional governments will get involved. A perfect example of this would be the North Central Texas Council of Governments. So this entity includes 16 counties in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area of Texas. And their goal is to coordinate, collaborate, and assist in sharing resources and information so that the response can be effective as possible. Now, in a larger event, those jurisdictions will need to seek help from the state in which they reside. So the governor may become involved, as well as a number of emergency management organizations. Now, again, every state is organized a little bit distinctly. So there could be a Department of Public Safety that really is coordinating things. There could be a Division of Emergency Management, or even some of those arrangements can fall under Homeland Security agencies or departments. But the point is that there's going to be some emergency management dedicated organization to help prepare and respond to disasters. Now, the governor may also call in the service of the National Guard, and these individuals can provide a whole range of services, whether it's removing debris or traffic control or security or those types of things. In a brush fire, for example, the Department of Forestry would become involved because disasters impact housing, The state housing agencies will get involved. Obviously, there's public health organizations at state government. They can assist in some type of pandemic. Now, disasters too do create a lot of environmental destruction and concerns, and so there will be some type of environmental agencies that could be involved at the state level. And then sometimes there's concerns about the settling of claims relating to insurance, so the Department of Insurance may become involved as well. So there's really a number of organizations at the state level, and I've just barely scratched the surface. Now, in major disasters, a state may not be able to respond to the needs of its communities within the boundaries of its territory, and so it may need to seek help from outside states. And that brings up the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. So EMAC was created in 1996. It was created in response to Hurricane Andrew and some of the challenges that we had there. This is managed and run by the National Emergency Management Association. This is a collection of state emergency management organizations. And the goal is to provide mutual aid, much like a local jurisdiction will receive aid from its nearby counties and cities. EMAC receives or provides support to affected states from nearby and also national states in our country. Now, in major disasters, the federal government may become involved, and I want to stress may be involved because they're not always involved. Smaller events are always handled by the local jurisdiction, the state, and others. But in major events, a disaster could be declared by the President of the United States, and this opens up funding and resources for those who are impacted. So the Department of Homeland Security would become involved in this particular case, and specifically FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. In certain disasters, we might need the Department of Justice involved. For instance, the FBI can investigate acts of terrorism. In disasters, as I've mentioned, housing could be depleted or destroyed or damaged, and so maybe HUD needs to become involved to provide assistance and help find ways to get people back into permanent homes. There's many other organizations that become involved. The Department of Defense has a lot of expertise in engineering. Health and Human Services would become involved in a pandemic, as I've mentioned, like COVID. And then the EPA also provides help and assistance for certain disasters, like a hazardous materials incident. Now, the federal government is organized into 10 regional offices. So every state reports to a regional FEMA office, and then that regional office reports to the national organization of FEMA. If you want to learn more about the federal government and all of the many different organizations involved, I would refer you to the National Disaster Response Framework and the National Disaster Recovery Framework. These describe who's involved and what the responsibilities are. Now, to summarize government, it might be best to look at the different roles from maybe a different vantage point. The local government is always the one that's impacted. It's directly responsible for dealing with a disaster. The state may provide assistance and help manage and oversee and provide resources for local governments that are impacted. And then the federal government provides a lot of financial assistance and other resources. So the federal government channels those resources through the state. The states distributes those and make sure that the local governments are responding to and accounting for the use of those funds in a disaster. Now, I do want to take just a moment and talk about tribal governments. There are 574 Indian tribes that are recognized by the United States. And their relationship to states and to the federal government is a little bit complicated. So let me just explain that. In some ways, a tribal government is like a jurisdiction within the state, such as a county or a city. But in other ways, a tribal government is like a country within the United States, meaning that they operate independently. And so in emergency management, we want to help and assist tribal governments whenever we can and whenever our assistance is needed. But we always have to respect autonomy because they're an autonomous government within the United States. All right, so that's the public sector. Let's talk more about now the private sector. So this would include businesses. So there's a variety of functions that are performed by businesses, and I'll just walk you through some examples of businesses that get involved. So first of all, we have risk management. Risk management is an effort to reduce liability, legal liability, and financial liability. So companies like Target will have someone that work in risk management to ensure or minimize risk and liabilities that could be faced when operating that business. There's also business continuity, which is an effort to basically keep a business running in spite of disasters and ensure that there's profitability. So banks will have people that work in business continuity. There's businesses that get involved in disaster recovery. Now, disaster recovery has different meanings for different groups and organizations, but in this context, in the private sector, it really refers to information technology. So computer data is really important to a company like Amazon, and they have to ensure that that data is protected and that there's backups, for instance. Companies also get involved in transportation, so there's many firms and companies that transport people via plane or trains or ship goods via trucks. And so they will have someone that is involved in emergency management activities in case there's some type of accident. The private sector also gets involved in sheltering and housing. So for instance, Marriott Hotel or other hotels will shelter people in time of a disaster. And of course, the private sector builds housing or repairs housing when that's damaged. The private sector or businesses also get involved in emergency medical care, ambulance services. So Acadian is one example that comes to mind. And then, of course, there's many hospitals throughout the United States that provide long-term medical care to disaster victims. Now, the media, whether it's ABC News or CNN or Fox News, the media gets involved in sharing information to the public, providing warnings when needed in case a disaster or a hazard is about to occur. The private sector also provides a lot of volunteers. So they will allow their employees to go and assist and help out a community that's affected by a disaster. They may provide donations as well. So for instance, a brewery might provide canned water to those in need who have been affected by a disaster. Insurance companies will also get involved when a disaster occurs. Allstate, State Farm will send their representatives there to settle claims. There's many utility companies that get involved and help to restore electricity or reconstruct homes, those types of things. And then the private sector also vends a lot of goods and services that emergency managers need. For example, Motorola provides communications equipment that would be very important for first responders or for reverse 911 systems. Now that brings us to the nonprofit sector. So one of the most important or most recognized nonprofit group is the American Red Cross. So this organization actually emerged in Europe after the Battle of Solferino in the 1800s. And Clara Barton noticed what they were doing in Europe. She was a nurse in the United States. And she wanted to bring that organization to America, and she did so in the late 1800s. And the organization, the American Red Cross, gets involved in a variety of activities relating to disaster health, mental health. They seek welfare inquiries. They provide family services to those in need. They provide mass care, sheltering, and other services like blood services in a disaster. So they're a very important nonprofit group in emergency management and in disasters. But there's also many other nonprofit organizations that get involved, and several of those are faith-based. One of the most well-known organization is the Salvation Army. This was formed in England in 1852, and it was later transplanted or transported to the United States. And so the Salvation Army provides food, water, and shelter to those in need in a disaster. There's a whole host of other organizations, Christian organizations, Methodist organizations, Latter-day Saint Charities, Catholic Relief Services, and even Muslim organizations that get involved to provide assistance of various kind to those who are affected by a disaster. In addition, we have others in the nonprofit sector. So, organizations like the United Way or Scouts get involved. They provide food, water, and clothing. There's organizations that may be involved, people that may be involved with AmeriCorps. And there's also even groups like Antifa. Antifa is an anti-fascist, anti-capitalist organization. Sometimes is violent in their protests and their activities. But even they become involved. For example, in Hurricane Harvey, they participated to help clean up after a flood. Now, there's a whole host of nonprofit organizations and scores and hundreds and even thousands of those nonprofit organizations. And so sometimes it's difficult to coordinate those groups, and that brings up the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster group. And this is a 110-member organization. The goal is to coordinate efforts among nonprofit agencies to avoid duplication or fill gaps to make sure that needs are being met. Now, not just government or businesses or the nonprofit sector are involved in disasters. Citizens and everyday people also participate. And on 9/11, for example, colleagues at work were helping one another evacuate and maybe providing some very basic first aid care until first responders or others could get there and help and participate. We've seen during Hurricane Ian a lot of people donate money and goods and supplies to those in need in Florida. And citizens will get involved in other ways by by helping to fill sandbags or donating blood when needed. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that emergent groups form after disasters. And these emergent groups are groups that didn't exist before a disaster. But because of the unique context of disasters and the needs that are not being met, citizens and others will come together and work and collaborate and coordinate and assist in any way they can. So this could include, light search and rescue activities. It could also include other activities, food drive or what have you for those in need. Now, some of these organizations are very short-lived. They're formed, they respond, and then they dissipate. In other cases, some of these organizations become permanent, like Mano a Mano after Hurricane Andrew in Florida. And so this organization has endured and assists in other disasters going forward. There's also CERT teams. So this is a community emergency response team or community emergency response training that citizens receive. So these people are trained by government leaders in emergency management in the local jurisdiction. They learn about various types of disasters, natural, technological, and other events like a terrorist attack. They learn how to do things to protect property, like turning off the gas or turning off water. They can put out fires, small fires, for instance. They could do light search and rescue and provide basic medical care. So this is an organization or a group of citizens that play a very important role in getting communities prepared to respond to disasters and have increased capabilities to react when stressful incidents occur. Now, as you can see, there's a whole host of organizations that participate in emergency management. Some of them are established, like a fire department. They existed before an event. Some of them are expanding organizations, like the Red Cross. So they grow and morph in unique ways as different people from across the country in the Red Cross, come to the scene of a disaster. There's extending organizations like churches, which take on new roles. So they existed before the disaster, but they're doing more in terms of reacting to a disaster than they normally would do, when that in normal times. And then, of course, we have emergent groups. We've talked a little bit about those groups. Those are spontaneous volunteers. Now, all of this is in reference to the Disaster Research Center typology, the organizational typology, which was created and introduced in 1963. And I think this is a useful tool to understand who gets involved and why things could be a little bit complicated. There's some organizations that are very dedicated to emergency management. There's others that are not so dedicated. Some of the organizations existed before disaster. Some of the organizations are brand new. And so with that in mind, it's no wonder why responses can be complicated and complex. And so we need to keep that in mind. Well, let me wrap up by sharing a few things. First of all, I love this quote by Ellis Stanley. He's an emergency management coordinator who worked in Los Angeles, and he said that all departments from aging to the zoo, so from A to Z, are involved in disasters and emergency management. And really, it extends beyond government, right? Everybody is involved. And so that brings us to our summary. There's a bunch of people involved in disasters, either to prepare and to respond, from the public, the private, the nonprofit sectors, and also citizens and emergent groups. So we need to keep the whole community involved. And I would refer you to this document provided by the Federal Emergency Management Agency and encourage you to read that and understand why it's important to get everyone involved and participate in disasters. So now you know who's involved. Good luck and stay safe.